Good afternoon. I'm Dan with Four Winds Ancestral Skills. Today we're out here in some lovely winter weather. Last time I checked it was about 15 degrees. There's a steady wind and it's snowing. So needless to say, it's very cold out here. So I'll be working on starting a fire with a ferro rod. Not terribly difficult, even in conditions like this if you know what you're doing and apply some simple techniques. So stick around. Couple considerations here. If you're out in the woods and a situation like this, you want to make sure that you have some shelter squared away, because it's really easy to start thinking about fire to warm up, because it is an important component depending on what you're doing. But in a situation like this, it's going to be cold all day, probably for the next couple of days. You're going to need shelter to keep you warm, whether that be a snow shelter. Tonight I'll be sleeping in a debris shelter that I've already made. I'll make a video of how to make one of those probably in the future. But needless to say, you need something like that. Even without a fire, something like that can save your life if you're in a situation like this and it's very cold out, you don't have adequate gear or adequate shelter. If you make something like a debris shelter or a snow shelter, that will keep you alive even without fire. So keep that in mind. The first consideration when we're doing this is where are we going to put our fire? You want to have a decent fire lay, just like you would on a bright and sunny day. Out here right now, of course, you're going to have to clear away a bunch of snow to get there. But kind of dig out an area if you want just a standard fire lay with some maybe rocks around it, something like that. Get all the snow out of there, and that's where you'd start. One thing you do have to remember is when you are doing a fire surrounded by rocks, keep in mind where those rocks come from. If you pulled those rocks out of a creek bed or something like that, and they happen to be saturated with water or have some water contained in them, when you heat them up they can explode. So wherever you collect your rocks from, make sure they're not in an area where they would be essentially soaking in water and have a high moisture content. Otherwise, they can explode and it is very unpleasant. Alright, the next thing we're going to need to do is gather actual material to burn. So what we do is take small things and work up to big things, essentially. You don't take a big log and try to put a match to it and expect it to catch on fire. You need to start with extremely small, work up to something the size of a pencil lead, then a pencil, then your thumb, on and on and on, and just make it bigger until you have an actual decent sized fire. Another thing you got to think about is the type of material you're bringing back, where you're getting it from. If it's laying on the ground, it's oftentimes wet. So small branches, stuff like that, if there's a dead tree that has some dead branches coming off it, or if it's a living tree that even still has dead branches coming off it, that's what you really want to look for. The dead branches on a tree are going to be a lot drier than something laying on the ground. So that's kind of what you want to look for. This time of year, it's hard to know what's dead and what's not sometimes because everything has its leaves gone other than the evergreen trees. So to give you an example here, this little branch, this tree here is still alive, so its branches are going to be very flexible. Now, if it was dead, the branches are going to snap. And let me rephrase, if it's dead and dry, the branches are going to snap, and that's what you're looking for. If they just kind of bend, they don't really snap, they're still green and they're not going to make very good tinder for your fire. So you want to try to focus on the dry stuff. Here we have a cedar tree. Now cedar and juniper, both really they're kind of interchangeable. They are extremely good plants for finding tinder and small sticks, stuff like that to help burn. The inner branches are usually very small, dry, and they burn very well. You don't really want to find branches on the ground generally. They're oftentimes wet, waterlogged, stuff like that, so they're not going to burn as well. What you want to do is find some dead branches on an actual tree optimally. Cedar trees are usually a good source of that. So what you do, number one, you come in here and get these little branches here. Little branches like this make excellent tinder to start a fire. Also, that's special with a cedar tree is the actual bark. Alright, get in here a little bit closer. This bark here peels off. So you can just take by hand, come in here and peel this off. And it takes a little bit, but you can get a bird's nest. Basically turn this, ruffle of the actual bark up and turn this into a bird's nest, which will catch a spark and get your fire going. Also, while I'm in here, these small little branches, they're not terribly big, but they will be your next level after you get the initial spark going to get your fire going. This build up to some bigger stuff like we have here, and just keep doing that. Usually when you're harvesting this stuff, gather as much as you think you need and then double it, because you don't want to be starting a fire and then realize you don't have enough of whatever type of material you need. You get that fire going, you want to be able to keep that going and keep building it up. It's real easy to get overzealous, start your fire too soon, and then realize that you don't have enough tinder or enough kindling or enough fuel, whatever the case may be. So always gather what you think you need and then some more. While I was out here looking for some tinder and kindling, stuff like that, gathering some wood, I came across a piece of fat wood. And this is an excellent resource when you want to start a fire. Basically what it is a fir tree, like a pine tree, that fell down and has slowly been rotting away. And what happens is it will rot away, but the inner sap in this thing will keep certain areas from rotting away, so it'll give it a bit of a ridged look, so it won't rot away evenly. So when you see stuff like this, you know that it contains a decent amount of resins that make an excellent accelerant when you're starting your fire. So you take this, shave down some small pieces, and it will catch like nobody's business. If you cut off a piece and it would, if you put a match to it or something like that, it would catch on fire and would start burning, almost like a candle wick. Now that we have some tinder to work with here, you want to lay out some kind of material, something like that. It really helps. That way you don't like lose all the stuff you're working on. But you want to take some of this bark, kind of rough it up some. That'll help it catch the spark a lot better. And like I said, if you have something put down on the ground, number one, it'll help keep your material drier. And number two, you won't lose it in the ground or in the grass or whatever you happen to be on that you're working with this stuff. But you take it, whether it be, like I said, grass, cedar bark, whatever the case may be, and you want to break it up and ultimately turn it into what's often called a bird's nest. So something like that will catch a spark fairly readily. Another thing, like I said, we found our fat wood. We got our fat wood right here. You can cut shavings off of the fat wood, and they also burn really well. So you just take it, you try to get decently long thin shavings are really optimal. But these will catch pretty well. Like I said, you want to avoid getting them in the snow. Of course, you don't want to get all your material wet from like fat wood, but just try to keep everything as dry as possible. It's not easy when it's raining, or like right now it's snowing decently well out, but to make what's called a feather stick, you take a stick and you essentially shave little pieces of it down. It gives it more surface area to catch. So you do something like this all the way up the stick, and that catches pretty well if you don't have any really small branches. I have a decent amount of small branches here, so I'm not really terribly worried about it. But you can do stuff like that to help catch if you don't have a lot of small branches or cedar trees, stuff like that in your area. And dead wood, like this size especially, the water generally doesn't penetrate down in there very well, so a lot of times you can find sticks this size that are dry. So you can just do that all the way down. Any of the little pieces that fall off, you can use those as tinder as well anyway. So, but that's, real quick, that's kind of how you do a feather stick. I'm not going to worry too much about that right now because I found a decent amount of small branches and everything that I can use. So, but you just want to shave really thin strips off of the fat wood. And when you're doing this with fat wood, you can take the pieces and you can actually smell it, and you can smell the pine pitch that's in here. It's really pungent once you start cutting down the outside from the outside layer in. And I don't know if you can see it very well on video, but this right here, you can kind of see the pine pitch residue in the actual wood, in the heart of this wood here. So yeah, you just shave off a bunch of pieces. We have that ready to go. You can mix that with a bird's nest. This is not a terribly big bird's nest, so you want to make sure you have some little sticks ready to go. Not very cohesive either, but it's not a big deal. Have some little sticks ready to go though. That way, when this thing does go, you can get your use out of it quick. Those fat wood shavings will really help the whole thing catch. So let's get back to our fire lay and make sure that's all ready to go. Okay, right here happens to be, I've been in this location before and I've already had a fire here a couple times. So this is where I want to start my fire tonight. Unfortunately, there's a ton of snow all over it. So what we want to do is just clear it away. There's probably a little bit of old wood in here. We can burn that later. Okay. That's good enough to start with. I'll take this here and make a little bit of a base with some wood, and then I'll make a little bit of a base with some wood, and then I'll show you where to go from here. Just kind of knock some of the snow off this and make a decent solid base here. Alright, now that we got a little bit of a base established, this should help the fire not get drowned out with the snow. There's some snow on top, stuff like that, but we can overcome that. It's not too big of a deal. This will definitely get us started here. Alright, let's see if we can get this. When you're using the ferro rod, keep in mind that you want to scrape the black material off first, and then you can get down to the actual spark. Next up, you want to think about your form, whether you're pushing down the ferro rod or taking your striker and holding it and pulling up on the against the striker. Oftentimes when you do it, pull up against the striker, you won't disturb your material that you're working with as much, but you kind of need to play with it and see what you like doing better. They both produce sparks and they both kind of have their place, but just keep that in mind. You don't want to disrupt all the material that you work so hard to create here. So I have my bird's nest there. It's had a lot of snow falling on it, so it's been getting kind of wet while I've been setting up the camera and everything else. So let's see if we can get a spark and maybe get something lit here. There we go. Okay, now you got the fire going here. Throw a lot of little tiny twigs on it, and then you just keep working on up. Right now, all this stuff is fairly wet because it's been snowing on it like this whole time. So you just take it slow. Don't overplay your hand, but once you got a decent fire, it'll also help dry out the twigs and stuff like that you put on there. The other thing you can do is also cut larger pieces of the fat wood. Cut bigger chunks, kind of like that, or even bigger. You could technically throw the whole piece of fat wood on there and burn that, but there again you lose the whole piece of fat wood all at once, so you don't generally want to do that, but yeah, bigger pieces like this. Kind of make little twig-sized pieces out of this piece of log here. And yeah, you just cut them off there with your knife or axe, whatever you happen to have. And those will really really get the fire going good. They make an excellent accelerant to give your fire that little extra boost. You got to consider is the wind today has been coming in a little bit different direction than it usually comes from. So you got to make sure if this is about on the edge right now, but you got to make sure if it's exposed to keep that in mind and try to shelter it as much as you can. Once the fire gets going a little bit more, the wind can actually help keep it going, but you don't want it when it's too early on to end up just basically blowing it out. So keep that in mind. Even these twigs are a little wet. Before the snowstorm, it was raining a lot, and then it had freezing rain, and then everything was wet, and then it froze, and then it snowed on top of that. So not the easiest conditions to make a fire out of, but we had a ferro rod, so that makes it a little bit easier than if we were trying to do a hand drill or a bow drill, something like that. Those can be a little bit more time consuming and difficult in these conditions, but not impossible, but certainly take a heck of a lot longer. So one thing I should probably go over real quick, talking about using the fat wood, or really any wood. If you want to use a larger piece of wood, but your fire is not capable of handling something like that yet, you want to make a smaller piece out of it. Of course, there's using a hatchet or something like that to split it, but you can also take an actual, just a survival knife, any kind of knife that's beefy enough to handle it, and you put it on a hard surface, place your knife where you want it to be, and you just take some kind of stick or something like that and hit it. And you can actually cut off smaller pieces and split the wood into smaller pieces. You gotta watch it. You gotta make sure you have a knife that's beefy enough to handle that, whatever type of wood you're splitting. If you're splitting smaller stuff, obviously a smaller knife will work. But you can just hold it there, place the knife, and take your stick. And cut those pieces off. That's a good way to use both fat wood and any kind of wood, really, just to cut it down to a smaller, more manageable size so that you can be able to get that fire going a little bit easier. Also, they say that it's good to make different shapes like the log cabin, the teepee, different things like that, different designs for your wood. Personally, I've never been a stickler for making certain types of shapes, stuff like that. The main thing is make sure that plenty of air can get in, and in general, fire likes chaos. Just branches kind of thrown on top, but still allowing a decent amount of airflow. That's really the key. You want plenty of airflow so the fire can burn up into whatever material you're going to have. So whether it's specifically a teepee shape or anything like that, it's probably the closest to an actual shape that I would use, is just stacking a bunch of sticks up and letting the fire burn up into them. And that's always worked well for me. So now we're cranking. We got a decent fire going, and even though the weather was against us, we finally were able to get it going. A lot of the sticks and everything like that had ice and, of course, snow on them, and then, of course, there's snow falling from the sky right now. But once you get it going, the fire can kind of, you can use it to heat some of the wood. As you can see up here, some of the bigger pieces I have stacked kind of above and behind the fire. That way they're getting a decent amount of the heat, and they can start to dry out, because when I first put them over there, they were covered with a layer of ice and then some snow on top of that, and I tried to bang them against a rock, but most of it wouldn't, especially the ice, wouldn't really come off very well. That's a big problem I was having with the smaller stuff down here. Same thing, but I finally was able to continue. Like I said, you put smaller stuff and keep building up to bigger and bigger and bigger, and then you can eventually start adding the bigger stuff. So, alright, there you have it. If it rains, freezes, and then snows on top of that, you can still make a fire. Biggest thing, have a little patience, start small, and persistence is ultimately the key. You keep going, you keep going. If you have a failure, if it goes out, if it starts to go out, whatever the case may be, keep at it, and you'll get better at it the more you practice it. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, need me to elaborate on anything further that I covered today, or have any suggestions for future videos or anything like that, you can reach me through my website at fourwindsancestralskills.com. Reach out, say hello, whatever the case may be. I'm always read your messages and get back to you as soon as I can. Sometimes I'll be out here in the middle of nowhere. I don't really have signal, but I'll eventually get to your message. So if you enjoyed the video, I hope to see you again on the next one. Or if you didn't, I hope to still see you again on the next one. I have some pork steaks I gotta cook because I'm getting hungry. I'm Dan with Four Winds Ancestral Skills, and I'll catch you out on the trail. Take care.